I want you to pay very close attention to what you are feeling right now, because the strange heaviness, uncertainty, and inner resistance that may have been following you are not appearing without a reason. Today, August 18th, the North Node officially leaves Pisces and moves into Aquarius, and this marks a profound change in the evolutionary direction of the collective for the next 18 months. This is not simply another shift in the zodiac that passes quietly in the background. It represents a dividing line between an identity, a way of living, and a way of processing reality that has been developing for a long time, and the version of yourself that is beginning to emerge now. Even before this transition becomes official, you may already sense that something is changing underneath the surface. Perhaps the past several days have felt strangely difficult to navigate. You may have been tired in a way that ordinary rest does not seem capable of touching. You may have wanted to make a decision, begin something new, or finally move toward a goal. Yet every attempt to move forward seemed to meet an invisible resistance. It can feel as though your body is ready to act, while your mind keeps searching through uncertainty for an answer that refuses to appear. That experience matters, because there is a very specific astrological reason behind this temporary sense of paralysis, and we will come back to it. But before you can understand why the present moment feels so unusual, you have to recognize what is actually coming to an end. The chapter closing now is far larger than a temporary mood or a passing emotional cycle. Since January of 2025, the North Node has been traveling through Pisces, placing the collective emphasis on surrender, trust, faith, and the difficult practice of releasing our obsession with controlling every possible outcome. On paper, that sounds peaceful. In real life, it could be incredibly demanding. Pisces asks people to loosen their grip on certainty and accept that not every answer could be forced into existence through effort. At the same time, the South Node in Virgo brought the opposite pattern into sharp focus. It revealed how much energy had been spent trying to repair everything, organize everything, anticipate every problem, and manage every tiny detail in the hope that perfect preparation would finally create emotional safety. Many people have lived inside that mental bargain for years. If I work harder, I will feel secure. If I plan more carefully, nothing can surprise me. If I correct every mistake, maybe life will finally become manageable. Yet the last 18 months repeatedly demonstrated that this strategy has a limit. Eventually, you reach a point where more effort does not create more certainty. And that realization can be deeply uncomfortable because it forces you to confront how much of your life has been driven by the fear of losing control. But the Pisces chapter carried another layer that could be equally difficult. Its shadow was the possibility of becoming so immersed in emotion, imagination, uncertainty, and collective sensitivity that the boundary between genuine intuition and personal projection became difficult to recognize. There were moments when the atmosphere around people felt so unclear that escaping reality could seem easier than facing it. Escapism increased. Misinformation moved rapidly. Emotional exhaustion caused many people to withdraw from the world because everyday reality simply felt too overwhelming to process. You may have recognized that impulse in yourself, the desire to disappear for a while, avoid difficult conversations, stop making decisions, or retreat into something that allowed you to feel less exposed to what was happening around you. That does not mean you were weak. It means the emotional atmosphere of this cycle could become extraordinarily difficult to carry. But today, that chapter reaches its conclusion. The long period of Pisces influence that has surrounded the collective for the last year and a half is giving way to a completely different energetic direction. The movement is from water toward air, from emotional absorption toward mental awareness, from dissolving boundaries toward creating ideas, structures, and purposeful direction. Instead of simply feeling everything, the next phase begins asking what you are going to do with what you have learned. Instead of remaining suspended inside uncertainty, you are being pushed toward a clearer relationship with thought, perspective, and conscious choice. That does not mean the transition will feel comfortable. In fact, the moment between two major cycles can feel more confusing before it becomes clear, because the old way of navigating life has already weakened while the new one has not fully established itself. This is why the timing of what has been happening over the last few days matters so much. Remember that strange fog I mentioned earlier? The feeling that you want to move but cannot quite identify the direction, the sensation that your energy is present, but somehow inaccessible. There is a very specific reason for it. Right now, literally today, August 17th, Mars in Cancer is forming an exact square to Neptune in Aries. In astrology, this configuration is often described as the fog of war, and that phrase captures the psychological atmosphere with remarkable precision. Mars normally represents movement, determination, initiative, desire, and the inner command that tells you to choose a direction and pursue it. Mars wants to act. Mars wants an objective. Mars wants to know where the target is. Neptune operates very differently. Neptune can blur boundaries, soften certainty, dissolve definitions, and make it difficult to distinguish what is actually happening from what fear, hope, memory, or imagination may be adding to the picture. When Mars forms this exact square to Neptune, the instinct to act can collide with uncertainty about what deserves action in the first place. You can feel ready to fight for something, and then suddenly question whether the battle is even real. You can become intensely motivated, and then lose that motivation without understanding where it went. You can spend hours analyzing a problem, only to realize that your mind has been reacting to possibilities rather than facts. This is what makes the transit so psychologically exhausting. The problem is not necessarily a lack of energy. The problem is that the energy does not have a clear channel. It is like trying to move through a dark room while reaching for an object you cannot clearly see. Every movement becomes a guess. Every hesitation feels like failure. Every emotional reaction can seem like evidence, even when it may simply be fear creating a story around uncertainty. And because Mars is currently in Cancer, the pressure is especially connected to the emotional, domestic, protective, and deeply personal areas of life. Home, family, emotional security, personal boundaries, and the instinct to protect yourself can become the places where this confusion feels strongest. You may find yourself reacting more strongly to something because it touches an old sense of safety, or feeling an urgent need to protect what matters to you without being completely certain what the real threat is. This is why the timing is so important. One major cycle is closing as another direction begins to open, while Mars and Neptune are creating an atmosphere in which certainty itself can feel temporarily unreliable. You are standing between endings and beginnings, between emotional surrender and a new demand for perspective, and between the instinct to act and the need to determine what is actually worth acting upon. That tension is not the end of the story. It is the threshold that explains why this moment can feel so disorienting. And understanding that threshold is what leads directly into the next part of this transformation. There is a reason you may feel like your emotions are sitting much closer to the surface right now. And before you judge yourself for it, I want you to understand what is happening beneath that reaction. You may suddenly feel unusually protective of your home, your family, your privacy, or the small personal spaces where you normally feel safe, as though something inside you is constantly scanning the environment for danger. You may interpret certain situations as threatening, even when there is no clear evidence that anything is actually wrong. Or perhaps your experience is the complete opposite. Instead of becoming defensive, you may feel so emotionally depleted that even the simplest task seems to require more energy than you have available, including things you already know need your attention. You might stare at something that matters to you and still feel unable to begin. If that describes what has been happening, please do not turn this experience into a judgment about your character. This does not mean you have suddenly become weak, irresponsible, unmotivated, or incapable of handling your own life. You are not broken, and you are not failing. You are moving through the very particular atmosphere created by this transit. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do inside such an atmosphere is recognize that not every internal storm needs to be defeated immediately. The cosmic conditions surrounding this moment are creating exactly the kind of uncertainty that can make ordinary decision-making feel unusually difficult, especially when you are already carrying emotional pressure. Think about what happens when you stand in a room filled with thick smoke. Your instinct is to move quickly because you want to escape, but moving too fast can make it even harder to understand where you are going. That is the lesson here. The universe is not necessarily creating this fog to punish you or make your life harder. Instead, this moment may be forcing you to discover what happens when you stop treating uncertainty as an emergency. You have spent enough time trying to push through every obstacle, solve every emotional question, anticipate every possible outcome, and force yourself into certainty before you feel ready. Right now, the invitation is different. Stop pushing against the fog. Stop demanding that every unanswered question become an answer immediately. Stop assuming that movement is always better than stillness. The clarity you have been waiting for is approaching with the nodal shift, but you cannot always reach clarity by chasing it. Sometimes you reach it by becoming quiet enough to notice what remains when the noise settles. I know that sounds easier than it feels. Sitting inside uncertainty can be deeply uncomfortable, especially if you are someone who normally finds relief through planning, fixing, organizing, or taking control. But during a Mars-Neptune square, forcing an answer can create even more confusion. Imagine standing beside a muddy river and desperately wanting to see what lies beneath the surface. If you keep stirring the water because you are frustrated that you cannot see clearly, the river will only become murkier. The answer is not more movement. The answer is allowing the water to become still. That is the emotional discipline this moment is asking for. You do not have to understand everything today. You do not have to make every decision today. You do not have to transform uncertainty into certainty before the universe is ready to reveal what comes next. What makes this especially striking is the timing. The Mars-Neptune square is occurring less than 36 hours before the nodal shift, which makes this feel like the closing examination of the Pisces chapter. After everything Pisces has asked us to learn about surrender, faith, release, and trusting what cannot yet be seen, there is one final question standing in front of us. Can you remain present when you do not know what happens next? Can you resist the instinct to force an outcome simply because uncertainty makes you uncomfortable? Can you trust that not having an answer does not mean that you are lost? That may be the final lesson before the collective direction changes. Then today, August 18th, the North Node officially crosses into Aquarius, while the South Node simultaneously moves into Leo. This begins an entirely different collective cycle for the next 18 months, extending all the way through March 2028. The significance of this transition becomes easier to understand when you compare the lessons of the two periods. The previous 18 months emphasized surrender, release, acceptance, and learning to move with circumstances instead of attempting to control every detail. Now the emphasis changes. The next chapter asks for awareness, clearer thinking, cooperation, and the creation of systems that can actually function in the real world. Aquarius is a fixed air sign, and its attention naturally moves beyond the individual toward the collective. It is concerned with groups, networks, communities, systems, and the ways human beings interact with one another. The question becomes less about how one person can stand above everyone else, and more about whether people can construct something that serves the whole. This changes the emotional orientation of the collective. Instead of asking only, "What do I want?" the Aquarian question becomes, "How do we function together?" Instead of focusing exclusively on personal recognition, the attention moves toward participation, contribution, connection, and the structures that influence everyone. That may sound hopeful, but there is a much more serious dimension underneath it, because this is not simply an ordinary North Node passage through Aquarius. Pluto is already in Aquarius, and Pluto has been there since 2023, gradually dismantling and reconstructing power structures on a global scale. That changes the weight of this nodal transition considerably. When the North Node moves toward Pluto in the same sign, building toward an exact conjunction in November 2027, the questions being activated are no longer limited to individual self-development. The evolutionary stakes become much larger, reaching into the architecture of civilization itself. This is about how technology influences human life, how governance evolves, how collective power is distributed, and how new systems reshape the relationship between individuals and institutions. Artificial intelligence, decentralized systems, digital infrastructure, and the technologies that increasingly mediate human interaction are all drawn into this larger Aquarian conversation. But we should not romanticize the Aquarian principle either, because every archetype contains both possibility and danger. At its highest expression, Aquarius can represent humanitarian thinking, equality, innovation, collective intelligence, and a genuine desire to create a better structure for everyone. But when that same ideal becomes distorted, the pursuit of the greater good can become an excuse for emotional detachment, excessive control, or the suppression of individuality. A system can claim to protect everyone while quietly deciding what everyone is allowed to see, choose, or believe. That is why questions surrounding surveillance, digital identity, and the ownership of the algorithms that increasingly influence perception are becoming so important. Over the next 18 months, those conversations are likely to become increasingly difficult to ignore. Yet there is something important I do not want you to miss. Feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of these questions does not automatically mean that what is unfolding is negative. Sometimes the intensity of a moment is evidence of its importance. The people who consciously participate in these questions, who remain awake enough to examine what is happening instead of emotionally abandoning the conversation, have a greater opportunity to influence the direction of what comes next. This is where your personal awareness connects with the larger collective story. You are not being asked to control the entire future. You are being asked to remain conscious enough to participate in it. And now we have to look at the other half of this nodal axis, because the North Node and South Node never operate independently. They always describe a movement between what we are being called toward and what we are being asked to release. As the North Node enters Aquarius, the South Node enters Leo, and that shift brings the focus directly toward one of the most personal challenges in this entire transition: the relationship between individual identity recognition pride and the collective future that is waiting to be built. There is another layer to this transition that you cannot fully understand until you look at what the South Node in Leo is asking the collective to leave behind, because this is not simply about changing signs. It is about changing what we are willing to feed with our attention, our admiration, and our energy. In evolutionary astrology, the South Node points toward patterns that have already served their purpose, experiences and tendencies that may once have helped us grow, but have now become excessive, unhealthy, or destructive when carried too far. Leo represents the individual desire to be recognized, the personal identity, the ego, creative expression, charisma, applause, visibility, and the longing to feel special or important. None of those qualities are automatically negative. In fact, healthy Leo energy can give people courage, creativity, warmth, leadership, and the willingness to put their unique gifts into the world. The problem begins when the desire to express yourself turns into a demand to constantly be watched, praised, validated, and centered. And if you step back and look honestly at the culture surrounding us, you can see how deeply this pattern has already taken root. We live inside an attention economy, where visibility itself has become a form of currency. Personal branding has become almost unavoidable. People are encouraged to turn their identity into a product, their private moments into content, their accomplishments into performances, and even their emotional experiences into something that can be displayed for an audience. The influencer era intensified this pattern, creating a world where being seen can sometimes matter more than actually being present. The idea of main character syndrome captures the same imbalance, the tendency to experience life as though every moment must reinforce a personal storyline, even when genuine connection requires stepping outside the spotlight. You can see similar patterns in politics, where personality cults and strongman theatrics can become more powerful than the actual systems or institutions surrounding the individual. This is Leo energy that has expanded beyond healthy self-expression and become excessive, inflated, and difficult to sustain. That is exactly where the South Node becomes significant. Over the next 18 months, the collective emphasis begins moving away from these exaggerated expressions of individual importance. The question will increasingly become whether something has genuine value when the applause disappears. Does the leader actually serve the people? Or does the audience exist primarily to reinforce the leader? Does the institution produce something meaningful, or has its reputation become more important than its substance? Does the public figure possess real influence, or simply an enormous ability to command attention? Systems that have been constructed primarily around ego, vanity, personal mythology, and the worship of personality may experience increasing pressure to demonstrate what they actually contribute to the collective. If there is no foundation underneath the image becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. And this is where the coming period can become especially dramatic, because another planetary influence is simultaneously amplifying the very Leo qualities that the South Node is asking us to reconsider. Jupiter entered Leo at the end of June, and it will remain there through mid-2027. Jupiter expands whatever it touches, magnifying the qualities associated with the sign and making them harder to ignore. So while the South Node is gradually draining energy from unhealthy Leo patterns, Jupiter is capable of making Leo expressions larger, louder, more visible, and more dramatic. That creates a fascinating contradiction. One influence can inflate the ego, while another exposes whether that ego has anything substantial underneath it. Imagine a structure being decorated more and more extravagantly while its foundation is quietly weakening. From the outside, it may appear stronger than ever. The lights are brighter, the presentation is bigger, the personality is more dominant. The spectacle becomes almost impossible to ignore. Yet, underneath all of that expansion, the actual support system may be deteriorating. That is the kind of tension this combination can symbolize. We could see enormous displays of personal power, increasingly grand performances, extraordinary demonstrations of status, and highly amplified personalities, while simultaneously discovering that some of these displays are far more fragile than they appear. Leaders, public figures, and entire institutions can grow rapidly through charisma and spectacle, only to lose momentum with surprising speed when people begin asking what exists beyond the performance. The more exaggerated the ego becomes, the more dramatic the contrast can be when reality exposes what was missing underneath it. You may even recognize a smaller version of this pattern in your own life. Perhaps you have watched someone become increasingly loud, increasingly demanding, increasingly focused on being admired, while at the same time becoming less emotionally grounded and less connected to reality. You may have sensed that their outward confidence was actually compensating for something much less stable underneath. If you have experienced that, understand that the symbolism of this period is not asking you to attack that person or become consumed by their behavior. It is asking you to recognize the difference between genuine strength and performance. That distinction becomes increasingly important as this cycle unfolds. And there is another reason the timing feels so intense, because the nodal transition is not occurring by itself. It is unfolding within an active eclipse season, which means the pressure for change is already elevated. Eclipses have a way of accelerating developments, exposing conditions that can no longer remain hidden, and creating turning points that feel more permanent than ordinary astrological events. On August 12th, only 5 days ago, there was a total solar eclipse in Leo. If that eclipse seemed unusually powerful, or if something around your identity, confidence, visibility, pride, or need for recognition suddenly became impossible to ignore, that reaction does not have to be dismissed as imagination. Solar eclipses are associated with major resets and new beginnings, often arriving through circumstances that were not fully anticipated. They can introduce developments that redirect the path ahead, rather than simply adding another event to the existing storyline. Because this total solar eclipse occurred in Leo immediately before the South Node officially enters Leo, it can be understood as an early glimpse of the larger reckoning that is now developing. It brought attention to places where pride may have been controlling decisions, where arrogance may have distorted perception, or where the hunger for validation may have quietly become stronger than the desire for authenticity. And this does not apply only to public life or collective culture. The same question can become personal. Where have you been performing instead of living? Where have you been trying to prove your worth instead of experiencing it? Where have you allowed the response of other people to determine how valuable you feel inside yourself? The eclipse can expose those patterns because it removes the comfort of pretending that they are not there. But the story does not end with the Leo eclipse. Another eclipse is waiting on August 28th, when a partial lunar eclipse occurs in Pisces. This arrives 10 days after the North Node has already departed Pisces, which gives this event the quality of a final emotional release from the era that has been closing. Lunar eclipses are associated with completion, culmination, emotional revelation, and endings that can no longer be postponed. They can bring feelings that have been buried into conscious awareness, and they can create the emotional circumstances necessary to close a chapter that you may have intellectually understood was finished, but emotionally continued to hold. That timing creates an extraordinary passage between two very different eclipse experiences. On one side, there is the total solar eclipse in Leo, connected with a new beginning and the confrontation with identity, pride, recognition, and personal expression. On the other side, there is the partial lunar eclipse in Pisces, arriving as the emotional release associated with the closing of the Pisces chapter. You are therefore moving through a symbolic corridor between beginning and ending, between what is emerging and what is finally dissolving. That can explain why life may feel unusually unstable at the moment. When one structure is ending before another has fully taken shape, the ground can feel unreliable. You may know that you cannot return to the old version of yourself while still having no clear picture of who you are becoming. That space can feel frightening because the human mind naturally wants certainty, labels, timelines, and guarantees. But a threshold rarely gives you those things immediately. Sometimes you recognize that you have crossed into a new chapter only after the old one has already lost its ability to hold you. This is why the present instability matters. You are not simply watching a cycle change from a distance. You are standing inside the transition between two collective stories. And when I began looking backward at previous North Node cycles, another pattern made this moment even more striking. The lunar nodes complete their full cycle approximately every 18½ years, which means we have historical examples of earlier periods when the North Node entered Aquarius. Those previous cycles give us a way to observe recurring themes, rather than treating this moment as though it exists in isolation. The pattern is particularly notable because every time the North Node has entered Aquarius during the last century, the period has coincided with major economic restructuring and rapid technological breakthroughs. That historical repetition becomes important because Aquarius is not only about abstract ideas or personal detachment. It concerns networks, systems, innovation, collective structures, and the ways society reorganizes itself when an old model can no longer keep pace with what is emerging. And that historical pattern gives us the next question we need to examine, because if earlier North Node passages through Aquarius were accompanied by major changes in economics and technology, what exactly might this current cycle reveal about the transformation already beginning around us? The historical record becomes much harder to dismiss when you place these previous Aquarius North Node periods beside the major transformations that happened around them. In 1933, the North Node was in Aquarius during the depths of the Great Depression, a period that led into the implementation of the New Deal and enormous systemic reform in the United States. The old economic structure had reached a point where simply continuing the existing model was no longer enough, and the response required fundamental changes in how the system itself functioned. Then, in 1971, another Aquarius North Node period coincided with a major financial turning point when Nixon removed the United States from the gold standard, fundamentally altering the structure of the global economy. At the same time, technological developments were accelerating, including the invention of the first microprocessor and the emergence of email. Then came 1989, another extraordinary example, when the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing a major geopolitical transformation, while Tim Berners-Lee proposed the World Wide Web, an idea that would eventually transform how humanity communicates, exchanges information, and connects across distance. Then we reached 2008, when the global financial crisis exposed and dismantled speculative bubbles, while the white paper for Bitcoin emerged as a proposal for a decentralized alternative. When you place these moments side by side, the recurring theme becomes difficult to overlook. Again and again, periods associated with the North Node entering Aquarius have coincided with major disruptions to existing economic structures, exposure of systems that had become unstable, and technological developments capable of changing the way people organize and connect. It creates a fascinating pattern between collapse and invention, between the weakening of an old structure and the appearance of something that could eventually replace it. The common thread is not simply financial difficulty or technological progress by themselves. It is the pressure to reconsider systems that have become unsustainable and the emergence of new methods for organizing collective life. In these historical examples, structures built around speculation, greed, excessive confidence, or unchecked ego eventually encountered circumstances that forced their weaknesses into view. At the same time, technologies appeared that opened entirely different possibilities for human connection and organization. So, does that automatically mean a financial crash is guaranteed during the next 18 months? No, that cannot be stated with certainty. Astrology cannot responsibly turn a historical pattern into an absolute prediction, but the pattern deserves attention, especially when you consider the speculative bubbles that have developed around AI valuations, technology monopolies, and overextended markets during the years leading into this cycle. Historically, these are precisely the kinds of conditions that can face significant correction during a North Node in Aquarius period. And when correction happens, whatever systems and technologies emerge afterward can become defining features of the era that follows. That is why this nodal transition deserves to be watched carefully. It is not only a spiritual concept that exists inside meditation, intuition, or personal transformation. It can also correspond with changes in the tangible structures through which society functions. Something larger is moving, and this is a moment when paying attention matters. But now I want to bring this much closer to you, because historical cycles can be fascinating to study, and global patterns can be enormous to contemplate. But the question that ultimately matters is what you're experiencing inside your own life. What does this change actually mean when you wake up tomorrow and have to live your ordinary day? What does it mean when you look at your relationships, your work, your community, and the direction you have been following for years. What I have been noticing, both personally and through the people around me, is a growing sensation that something fundamental is preparing to change. It does not necessarily feel like an abstract spiritual idea. It can feel remarkably specific, almost physical, as though one chapter of your life is reaching its natural conclusion, while another possibility is appearing in front of you without waiting for permission. Maybe you have started feeling drawn toward a different community, a different group of people, or a different way of contributing your abilities. Perhaps friendships or alliances that once felt natural now feel strangely repetitive, as though the relationship itself has not necessarily become wrong, but the version of you participating in it has changed. You may have been hesitant to admit that because recognizing that you have outgrown a connection can bring guilt, nostalgia, or fear. Maybe the career path you chose, because it promised recognition, individual achievement, personal reputation, or the satisfaction of building something that carried your name, has begun to feel strangely empty. From the outside, everything may still look successful, yet internally, there is a quiet question that refuses to disappear. Is this really what I am here to build? If you recognize yourself in any of this, do not immediately label the feeling as dissatisfaction or ingratitude. It may be the nodal shift, revealing that the definition of success you have been following no longer satisfies the person you are becoming. Your inner system can sometimes detect a change before your conscious mind has language for it. The Aquarius North Node will spend the next 18 months asking a deceptively simple question: what are you contributing to something larger than yourself? Not what are you receiving, not how much attention are you getting, not whether people recognize your accomplishments. What are you actually helping create that benefits a network, a community, or the collective? That question can feel uncomfortable because it moves the focus away from personal validation and toward meaningful participation. And if you honestly cannot answer it yet, that is not a failure. You do not need to arrive at this new chapter with a complete blueprint. You only need to become willing to ask the question sincerely. Sometimes the beginning of a new direction is not an answer at all. Sometimes it is the moment you finally admit that the old question is no longer enough. And tonight, before everything fully shifts, I want you to treat yourself gently. If you are still experiencing the fog created by the Mars square Neptune, the amount of information surrounding this transition may feel overwhelming. The final night before the nodal shift can carry a strange emotional weight. You might feel exhausted without understanding why. You might experience sadness without being able to identify exactly what you are mourning. You may even notice anticipation and grief existing at the same time, as though part of you already knows that something is ending, while another part has no idea what the next destination will look like. Imagine standing at an airport gate, saying goodbye to someone you deeply care about, knowing that you're about to board a flight toward a place you have never visited before. There is excitement because something new is waiting, but there is also tenderness because you cannot take the old moment with you. That is the emotional quality of this threshold. Something is ending. The Pisces era asked you to experience life through feeling, to soften your defenses, to remain with uncertainty, and to develop trust even when circumstances refuse to provide immediate explanations. Whether you believe you handled those lessons perfectly or struggled through many of them, the chapter is now complete. You made it through the experience. You reached the other side of it. And what begins now carries a very different atmosphere. The air becomes clearer, thought becomes more prominent, perception becomes more objective, and there is a stronger emphasis on structure, systems, and collective purpose. That shift may not feel soft or comforting, because Aquarian energy does not operate with the same emotional sensitivity associated with Pisces. Aquarius can be electric, disruptive, detached, and focused on what needs to change rather than on protecting everyone from discomfort. Yet there is also something refreshing about that quality. After spending 18 months moving through uncertainty, there can be relief in finally confronting reality more directly. The next 18 months will challenge all of us to look beyond the boundaries of individual identity, to question the parts of ourselves that have been constructed around performance recognition and applause, and to engage consciously with technology community and systemic change. We are being asked not merely to watch these developments from the sidelines, but to recognize that our choices contribute to the systems we participate in. The central movement is from "how can I stand out" to "how can we create something meaningful together?" And the people who genuinely respond to that shift, who become willing to exchange isolated personal validation for meaningful collective contribution, are the ones most aligned with the direction of this cycle. You are standing at the threshold now. Today, you cross it. And even if you do not feel completely prepared, you may be far more ready than you think. And if you have stayed with me through this entire conversation, I genuinely appreciate that. If this message has reflected something you have been experiencing, if these themes have been appearing in your relationships, your emotions, your work, or your sense of direction, I would appreciate you subscribing to the channel, because that support means more than you may realize. And I would also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what you have been feeling this week. Tell me what has been changing, what has felt different, and what you have noticed shifting inside your own life. I read every comment, and during a transition like this, there is something powerful about recognizing that other people are experiencing their own version of the same collective movement. You do not have to pretend that everything feels easy tonight. You do not have to force yourself to understand the entire future. Be gentle with yourself. Allow this threshold to be what it is, and carry that awareness with you as you move into what comes next. I will see you in the next one.